Stand up right now and apologize to my daughter for poisoning her career, or your badge stays on this table when you walk out." The chairman's voice didn't even shake. He just slid a manila envelope across the boardroom table like he was passing a check. Except what was inside that envelope was supposed to end me. 11 board members stared at their water glasses. Nobody breathed. My boss's daughter sat 2 seats down from her father with that little curl at the corner of her mouth. The one she gets when she thinks she's already won. My name is Daniel Foxworth. I'm 53 years old. I spent 9 years as an Army combat medic, 2 tours in Iraq, and the last 19 years working my way up from 3rd shift line supervisor to director of quality assurance at Brennan Hollister Pharmaceuticals outside Indianapolis. And that moment in the boardroom on a wet Thursday morning in March was supposed to be my funeral. But let me back you up about 14 months, because none of what happened in that room makes sense unless you know what came before it. Back then I was running QA out of Building C, our oncology generics plant. 47 people reported to me, half of them with 20+ years on the floor. The kind of folks who could spot a contamination event by the smell of the air handler before any sensor flagged it. We made injectable chemo drugs, methotrexate, cyclophosphamide, the generics that Medicare covers when the brand name versions get too expensive for grandmas in Terre Haute. That's not marketing, that's literally who our drugs went to. Old folks, kids in St. Raffand, Jude pediatric protocols, veterans at the VA in Indianapolis, people who didn't have a choice. I knew every SOP in that plant by heart. I knew the FDA inspector who'd been coming through since 2009 well enough that we'd grab coffee at the Cracker Barrel off I-465 whenever she rolled into town. I'd built my career on one principle. If it goes in a vein, it goes through me first. My wife Linda used to tease me that I treated those vials like they were our own kids' medicine. She wasn't wrong. Then the founder retired. Old man Brennan, who started the company in his garage in 1978, finally let go at 81 and turned the keys over to his son-in-law, a guy named Holt Brennan Vance. Holt had spent 20 years in private equity in Chicago before he married into the family. The first time I met him, he asked me what my value-add metric was. I told him my value-add was that nobody who took our drugs ended up dead from contamination. He laughed like I'd made a joke. 3 months after Holt took over, he brought in his daughter, 28 years old, MBA from Northwestern Kellogg, 3 years at a McKinsey office in Boston doing what she called operational excellence consulting. Her name was Saskia Brennan Vance. First day on the job, she walked the plant floor in 4-inch heels and a cream-colored blazer. And when one of my line techs warned her about the wet floor near the autoclaves, she gave him a look like he'd just insulted her ancestors. She was hired as Vice President of Operational Strategy, brand new title, made up for her far as I could tell. Holt sat me down that Friday and told me Saskia would be shadowing my department for 90 days to identify margin compression opportunities. I asked what that meant in English. He said she'd be looking at our SOPs and our cost structure to see where we could move faster. I told him pharmaceutical manufacturing isn't supposed to move faster. It's supposed to move correctly. He told me to keep an open mind. I should have quit right then. I'm telling you that as the guy who lived it. I should have cleaned out my desk that afternoon, called the headhunter who'd been pestering me from a competitor in Cincinnati, and walked. But I had Linda's medical bills hanging over us. She'd been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer 8 months earlier. We were drowning in co-pays, even with good insurance, and I had 2 years left until my pension vested at 20 years. So I stayed. I told myself I could manage one MBA kid. That was my first mistake. Saskia's first big idea, which she presented in a PowerPoint deck with animated transitions, was to cut our microbial endotoxin testing frequency from every batch to every 5th batch. She called it a risk-adjusted sampling regime. I sat in that conference room and watched her click through slides about Six Sigma and statistical process control, and how our testing protocols were legacy artifacts of pre-modern manufacturing science. When she finished, 3 of the VPs clapped. I waited until everyone was quiet. I said, "Mom, with respect, the reason we test every batch is because endotoxins don't follow statistical distributions. 1 contaminated batch goes out. 6 chemo patients with compromised immune systems go into septic shock, and we're on the front page of the Indianapolis Star next to a photo of a dead child." She told me I was being emotional. I told her I was being a medic. She didn't know what to do with that. Her second idea, 2 weeks later, was to switch our raw API supplier from the FDA-registered manufacturer in Hyderabad we'd used for 11 years to a cheaper one in Wuhan that had been on the FDA's Form 483 list twice in the last 3 years. She had cost projections showing we'd save $4.8 million a year. I pulled the inspection reports from the FDA's public database and showed them to her. Cross-contamination findings, data integrity violations, a 2019 warning letter about falsified stability testing. She told me the warning letter had been remediated. I told her remediated meant the company had said sorry, not that the problems were fixed. That's when she went around me. She walked into Holt's office, told him I was obstructing modernization, and 12 hours later I got an email saying the Wuhan supplier had been approved for our cyclophosphamide line pending expedited qualification review. Expedited qualification review is regulatory speak for we'll do the paperwork after we already started using the stuff. That's not how it works. That's never how it works. I went to Holt directly. I sat across his desk and laid out the FDA timeline, the warning letter, the chain of custody issues. He listened with this patient expression on his face, the way you listen to a kid explain why he doesn't want to eat his vegetables. When I was done, he said, "Daniel, I appreciate your institutional knowledge, but Saskia has the analytical training to make these calls now. Your job is to support the strategic direction. If you can't do that, we may need to talk about whether this role still fits you." There it was. Support the fraud or find another job. Now, here's where it got personal for me, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me, because this part still gets me choked up. Linda finished her chemo 3 months before all this started. The drug she'd been on for 6 cycles, cyclophosphamide. Same drug we manufactured on line 4 in Building C. Same drug Saskia was about to start sourcing from a supplier with documented contamination issues. My wife had finally been declared no evidence of disease, and now the company I'd given 19 years to was about to start putting compromised drugs into the same veins my wife had bled from. But ho naya before it could go inside. I think Linda knew something was wrong, but she didn't push. She made meatloaf and we watched Jeopardy, and I went to bed and stared at the ceiling until 4 in the morning. Then I got up and started a notebook. Every email Saskia sent me, I forwarded to my personal Proton account, the encrypted one I'd set up after a buddy from my army days, a guy who'd ended up working federal security clearance work in DC, had drilled into me years ago that any communication on company hardware is company property. I started keeping a paper journal in a drawer at home. Dates, times, who said what, who was in the room. I went through our document management system and pulled offline copies of every SOP, every batch record, every supplier qualification document on a personal USB drive that lived in my truck's glove box. If they were going to come for me, I was going to make sure I had receipts. The breaking point came in the second week of October, when Saskia called what she labeled an operational alignment meeting for the QA team. She brought in a guy named Corbin Vance, her older brother, who'd been hired the month before as Chief Strategy Officer. Corbin was 34, also Northwestern MBA, also zero pharmaceutical background. He'd been running a fintech startup in Austin that had gone under the previous spring. Now he was making $320,000 a year, telling chemists how to do their jobs. In that meeting, in front of my whole team, Saskia announced that effective immediately, batch release authority for the cyclophosphamide line would be moved from QA to a new role she was creating called Director of Operational Throughput. The Director of Operational Throughput would report to her. The Director of Operational Throughput would not need to be a licensed pharmacist or a regulatory professional. The Director of Operational Throughput would be Corbin. Her brother, failed fintech guy, was going to start signing off on chemo drugs. I asked, calmly in front of 47 people, whether the FDA had been notified of this change in our quality unit structure. Because under 21 CFR 211, the quality unit has independent batch release authority, and you can't move that to someone in commercial operations without notifying the agency and updating your site master file. She told me, and I'm quoting this verbatim because it's burned into my brain, she said, "The FDA doesn't tell us how to run our business. We tell them." I just stared at her. That's when I knew this wasn't going to get fixed inside the company. This was going to have to get fixed from outside. The next morning, I called a number I hadn't called in 14 years, a woman named Marjorie Albright. She'd been a senior compliance officer at FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation when I first met her in 2010, and she'd retired in 2018 to a small consulting practice in Bethesda, where she helped pharma companies get out from under warning letters. But more importantly, Marjorie was a retired Navy Reserve captain who'd spent the back half of her career working medical product safety for the Department of Defense. She knew everybody at FDA. She knew everybody at DOJ. And she knew me because back in 2014 I'd been the QA director who'd voluntarily disclosed a deviation on one of our antibiotic lines that other companies would have buried. She'd told me back then that if I ever needed a sounding board, her line was open. I called her from my truck in the parking lot of a Speedway gas station on my lunch break. I didn't say anything classified or specific. I just told her I was looking at what I believed was a pattern of regulatory violations at my company, and I needed to understand my options. She asked one question. She asked if anyone had been hurt yet. I said not yet. She said, "Then we have time." She told me to drive to a coffee shop in Carmel on Saturday morning and bring everything I had. I spent that Friday night photocopying. Linda asked me what I was working on. I told her I was preparing for an audit. She squeezed my shoulder and went to bed. I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning and built a binder. Specification documents, supplier audit reports, the email chain authorizing the Wuhan source, the meeting minutes from Saskia's PowerPoint, the change control request for Corbin's batch release authority. 312 pages. Marjorie met me at a Panera off Main Street. She was 66 years old, white hair, navy windbreaker, the kind of woman who could disarm a senator with a single raised eyebrow. She read for 2 hours while I drank coffee and watched the parking lot. When she finished, she closed the binder and said 3 words. "This is fraud." She walked me through it. The False Claims Act applied because Medicare and the VA were our biggest customers, which meant every adulterated batch we shipped was a false claim submitted to the federal government. The whistleblower provision, the qui tam statute, meant that if I filed a sealed complaint in federal court and the government took up the case, I'd be entitled to between 15 and 30% of whatever the government recovered. Given what she was seeing, that recovery could be in the 8 figures, but more importantly, she said, federal whistleblower protections under the False Claims Act and the FDA Safety and Innovation Act meant they couldn't legally retaliate against me. If they tried, I'd own the company. She gave me the name of a law firm in Washington that specialized in qui tam cases. She said, "Don't call them from your office phone. Don't email them from your work computer. And for God's sake, don't tell your wife yet, because attorney-client privilege wouldn't cover her, and they could subpoena her testimony." I almost cried in that Panera. Not from fear, from relief. For the first time in 3 months, I knew what to do. Over the next 6 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Daniel Foxworth. cooperative QA director, smiling through meetings where Saskia and Corbin dismantled the quality system I'd spent 2 decades building. By night, I was working with a lawyer named Jocelyn Pruitt at the firm in DC, building a sealed complaint that ran 187 pages with 41 exhibits. We filed it under seal in the Southern District of Indiana on the 11th of November. The Department of Justice had 60 days to decide whether to intervene. I also started talking to people inside the plant. Carefully. Quietly. Just one at a time. Always off-site, always in private vehicles or at my buddy's hunting cabin out by Brown County State Park where there was no cell service. I built a list. There was Pavla Stojanovic, our senior microbiologist, who'd been with the company 23 years and held a PhD from Purdue. She'd already documented her objections to the endotoxin testing changes in a memo Saskia had told her to retract. She still had the original. There was Tyrell Bouchard, third-shift production supervisor, 12 years with the company, former Navy hospital corpsman like Marjorie. He'd been keeping his own log of every deviation Corbin had pressured the line to ignore. There was Esther Quintanilla, our regulatory affairs specialist, who had emails from Saskia explicitly instructing her to omit the supplier change from our annual report to FDA. That's a federal crime by itself. I had a team. They didn't all know about the qui tam filing, but they knew I was building a case, and they were ready. Meanwhile, Saskia was building her own case against me. I figured that out the 3rd week of December when our IT director, a quiet guy named Bishop Larkin, who I'd helped get hired 5 years earlier, pulled me aside in the cafeteria. He said, "Daniel, I just want you to know, your computer activity has been getting reviewed weekly since October. Saskia and Corbin are pulling logs, email, browser history, file access, all of it. They've also installed network monitoring on the conference room phones." I asked him why he was telling me. He said because his sister had died of leukemia in 2007 and she'd been on a generic chemo drug, and he could put 2 and 2 together about what Saskia was trying to do. He said, "I'm not going to spy on you for them. If they ask me to escalate anything, I'll tell you first." I bought that man a steak dinner the next weekend. But Bishop's warning changed my strategy. I stopped using my work laptop for anything sensitive. I started doing all my drafting on a personal MacBook I kept locked in my truck. I assumed every word I said in the office was being recorded. I treated every email like it would be read in court. Which, as it turned out, some of them eventually were, but not the way Saskia had planned. The end of January, things came to a head fast. Saskia had scheduled a major FDA pre-approval inspection prep for the 1st week of February. The agency was coming to qualify a new sterile fill line we'd built for a generic version of a high-value oncology drug, contract value north of $240 million over 5 years for Medicare and the DoD. She'd already been telling the FDA in pre-meetings that I was leading the technical presentation. What she hadn't told them was that she was planning to have me present a set of qualification documents that had been rewritten to hide 3 serious deviations from the construction qualification phase. In other words, she was setting me up to commit perjury in front of a federal regulator. On the last Friday in January, I came back from lunch to find Saskia in my office. She was sitting in my chair. She had a folder in front of her. She told me, very pleasantly, that there'd been some performance concerns raised about my leadership, and that she'd be presenting a recommendation to the board at the March meeting regarding transitional leadership arrangements in QA. She wanted me to know that if I cooperated with the upcoming FDA inspection and helped ensure a smooth approval, she'd recommend a generous separation package. If I didn't, well, the board would have to weigh all available facts about my conduct. I asked her what facts those were. She slid the folder across my desk. Inside were copies of emails I'd allegedly sent to a competitor, leaking proprietary information about our manufacturing processes. They were fakes. Crude ones, actually. The metadata wouldn't have survived 10 minutes of forensic review, but they didn't need to survive a court case. They just needed to survive a board meeting where 11 directors with no technical background would take the chairman's son-in-law's daughter at her word. I told her I'd think about it. She smiled and left. I drove straight from work to Marjorie's hotel. She was in Indianapolis that week, ostensibly for a conference, but actually to be close by in case things accelerated. I showed her the folder. She made a single phone call. By Monday morning, 2 FBI agents from the Indianapolis field office were sitting in her hotel suite with me, taking a sworn statement about evidence fabrication, witness tampering, and obstruction. Federal crimes layered on top of the existing fraud case. That's when the United States Attorney's Office in Indianapolis decided to intervene in my qui tam case. The seal was lifted on February 20th. Saskia, Corbin, and Holt didn't know yet, but the entire federal apparatus had just turned to face them. The board meeting was scheduled for the 7th of March, a Thursday. I knew it was coming. Marjorie and the prosecutors knew it was coming. We let them schedule it. The morning of the meeting, I kissed Linda goodbye, told her I might be home late, and drove to the office with a slim leather portfolio. Inside the portfolio was a thumb drive, a printed agenda, and a single sheet of paper with my closing remarks. Saskia met me in the lobby with that little smile of hers. She told me she'd reserved a seat for me at the table. I told her I appreciated it. The boardroom on the 14th floor was the kind of space designed to intimidate people. Long mahogany table, leather chairs, panoramic view of the Indianapolis skyline. 11 directors plus the executive team. Holt at the head of the table, Saskia to his right, Corbin next to her, their cousin Brielle, who served as corporate counsel, on the other side. The Brennan Vance family lined up like a firing squad. Holt opened the meeting. He didn't waste time. He said, "Before we proceed to the strategic items on today's agenda, we need to address a personnel matter regarding our Director of Quality Assurance." He nodded at Saskia. Saskia stood up and started presenting a slide deck about my documented performance failures, my resistance to organizational evolution, and the ethical concerns raised by the fabricated emails. Halfway through her presentation, the chairman, a retired bank executive named Pierce Whitmore, who'd been on the board for 15 years, raised his hand and asked if I'd be given an opportunity to respond. Holt said, "Of course," after Saskia finishes. Saskia finished. She sat down. Holt looked at me and said, "Daniel, this board has reached a preliminary conclusion. We're prepared to offer you a separation package contingent on your immediate resignation and a signed non-disclosure agreement. Or we can proceed to a vote on termination for cause. Stand up and apologize to my daughter for what you put this family through. Accept the package, and you can walk out of here with your reputation intact. Or don't, and we'll do this the hard way." That was the moment. I stood up. I walked to the front of the room. I asked the AV technician, a kid named Roman, to please connect my thumb drive to the projector. Roman looked at Holt, looked at me, and then plugged it in. The screen filled with a document. The cover page read, "United States of America, ex-rel. Daniel R. Foxworth v. Brennan Hollister Pharmaceuticals Inc. et al. Civil Action 124 ZV 0847 RLY MJD, filed under seal November 11. Seal life did February 20. The room got quiet in a way I'd only experienced twice in my life. Once in a firefight outside Fallujah, and once in the waiting room when Linda's biopsy came back. That kind of quiet. I told them the document on the screen is a federal qui tam complaint that I filed under the False Claims Act 4 months ago. The Department of Justice has intervened. The complaint alleges that this company, under the direction of the individuals to my right, has been engaged in a systematic conspiracy to defraud Medicare and the Department of Defense, to adulterate injectable oncology drugs, to obstruct FDA oversight, and to manufacture and distribute pharmaceutical products that pose an imminent risk of harm to patients, including United States military veterans receiving care at federal facilities. I clicked to the next slide. Audio waveform. I pressed play. The room filled with Saskia's voice, recorded the previous Friday in my office, telling me, "The FDA doesn't tell us how to run our business. We tell them." Then Corbyn's voice from a meeting in November, telling Pavla Stojanovic that he didn't care what the SOPs said. The line was running tonight. Then Holt's voice from a phone conversation his executive assistant had inadvertently saved to a shared drive, telling Saskia that they needed to neutralize me before the FDA inspection, because I knew too much about the Wuhan situation. Holt's face went the color of wet ash. I clicked again. Side-by-side comparison. Original supplier qualification documents versus the rewritten ones Saskia had wanted me to present to FDA. I clicked again. The fabricated emails she'd shown me, with forensic metadata analysis from the FBI lab proving they'd been created on Corbyn's personal laptop 3 days before she'd presented them to me. I clicked again. The names of the federal prosecutors handling the case, the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations agents assigned, and the case docket number that any board member could look up on Pacer right then on their phone. Pierce Whitmore stood up slowly. He looked at Holt. He said, "This meeting is adjourned pending counsel." The doors at the back of the boardroom opened. 3 FDA OCI agents and 2 FBI agents walked in. They walked past me. They walked to Holt, Saskia, and Corbyn. The lead agent, a tall black woman in a charcoal suit, identified herself and read them their rights. Saskia started crying. Corbyn tried to leave the room, and one of the FBI agents physically blocked him. Holt didn't say anything. He just sat there looking at the table while they cuffed his daughter in front of the board of directors of his own company. I walked out of that building at 4:17 in the afternoon. Marjorie was waiting in the parking garage. She drove me home. I told Linda everything that night, sitting at our kitchen table with 2 glasses of bourbon I almost never drank. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You should have told me." I said, "I know." She said, "But I'm glad you did it." She held my hand and we cried for about 10 minutes. And then she made grilled cheese and we watched Jeopardy. Walk had 18 months to fully play out. Holt Brennan-Vance pled guilty to conspiracy to defraud the United States, adulteration of a drug under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and obstruction. He got 11 years in federal prison at FCI Terre Haute and personally agreed to $42 million in fines and restitution. Saskia pled guilty to fraud and obstruction and got 6 years at FPC Alderson in West Virginia. Corbyn took a deal in exchange for cooperation against his father and sister, got 3 years probation and was permanently barred from any role in healthcare or government contracting. Brielle, the cousin, lost her law license and is currently a paralegal in Cincinnati. The company itself paid a total of $218 million to resolve the False Claims Act case, plus additional FDA civil penalties. Under the qui tam statute, my share as the relator came to 22% of the recovery. After legal fees and taxes, Linda and I cleared just over $26 million. We paid off the mortgage, we paid off her medical bills, we set up a foundation in her honor for breast cancer patients in central Indiana who can't afford their copays. We took our 2 grown daughters and their husbands to Italy for 10 days. The Brennan-Hollister board, with the criminal Brennan-Vance branch removed, asked me to step in as interim CEO during the reorganization. I told them no. Then they asked me to take the role of Chief Quality Officer, reporting directly to the new independent board. I told them yes, but only for 2 years, and only if they let me bring in people I trusted. Pavla became my deputy. Tyrell got promoted to Director of Manufacturing. Esther leads Regulatory Affairs. Bishop runs IT and security and has full authority to investigate any executive misconduct, including mine, without notice or approval. We replaced every single supplier Saskia had brought in. We restored every SOP she'd modified. We invited FDA to do a full comprehensive inspection in October of the year after the indictments, and we passed it without a single 483 observation. First time in the company's history. The thing I want anybody watching this to understand is that I didn't win because I was smarter than them. I'm not. Saskia had a Northwestern MBA. Corbin had built and lost a software company. Holt had run private equity deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They were credentialed. I was an army medic who'd worked his way up from third shift on a generic injectables line. I won because I was right and I had documentation, and I was willing to spend 14 months living a double life to do something about it. If you find yourself in a situation like this, here's what I learned. First, do not trust company hardware. Anything you say on a company phone, in a company email, on a company laptop, in a company conference room belongs to the company and can be turned against you. Get a personal device. Get encrypted communication. Pay for it yourself in cash if you have to. Second, build a paper trail before you need one. Every important conversation gets a follow-up email summarizing what was decided, sent from a personal account to a personal account. Every weird request gets documented in a notebook the company can't subpoena out of your house without a warrant. Third, the federal whistleblower laws are real and they actually work, but you need a lawyer who specializes in them, not your cousin who does real estate closings. A qui tam specialist. They work on contingency. You don't pay anything unless you win. Fourth, and this is the one that took me longest to internalize. The people who run these schemes are not as smart as they think they are. They rely on intimidation, on the assumption that you roll over, on the fact that most people don't know their rights and can't afford to fight. The minute you stop being intimidated, the minute you find one person on the outside who has more power than they do, the whole thing collapses. Marjorie wasn't a superhero. She was a 66-year-old retired bureaucrat with good contacts and a clear conscience. That's all it took. Fifth and finally, when somebody who's never done your job tries to tell you how to do your job, and they're willing to put people's lives at risk to do it cheaper, you have a moral obligation to fight, not a polite suggestion. An obligation, because if you don't, somebody dies. Maybe an old man in a VA hospital. Maybe a kid on a pediatric ward. Maybe your own wife. Those drugs Saskia wanted to source from Wuhan. Linda was 3 months out from her last chemo cycle when I caught it. If she'd had a recurrence and gone back on cyclophosphamide 18 months later, she'd have been getting injections from that exact supply chain. Holt thought a private equity background made him qualified to run a pharmaceutical company. Saskia thought a Kellogg MBA made her qualified to override 20 years of regulatory science. Corbin thought failing upward in Austin made him qualified to release sterile injectables to cancer patients. They were all wrong. And the cost of being wrong in this industry isn't a bad quarter. It's a funeral. My name is Daniel Foxworth. I'm still here. I'm still doing the work. I'm still making sure the people who depend on our drugs to stay alive get drugs that actually work. And every morning I drive into that parking lot, I think about my wife, and I think about the patients we serve, and I remember that integrity isn't a credential you put on a resume. It's a choice you make at 4 in the morning when nobody's watching. The Brennan Vance family learned that the expensive way. Some lessons can't be taught in business school. Looking back on those 14 months, I keep coming back to one simple truth. Every choice has a tail, and that tail catches up to you whether you want it to or not. Holt thought he could marry into a pharmaceutical company and run it like a private equity portfolio. Saskia thought a Northwestern degree gave her the right to override 20 years of regulatory science she'd never studied. Corbin thought failing in Austin meant he deserved to succeed in Indianapolis. They all believed the same thing in different costumes. They believed that consequences were something that happened to other people. I didn't sit in my truck that night in October because I was clever. I sat there because I was scared. Scared of losing my pension. Scared of telling Linda the company was about to put compromised drugs into the supply chain that had probably saved her life. Scared of being the guy who saw it coming and didn't do anything. What I learned in that garage is that fear isn't your enemy. Fear is information. It's your conscience telling you what matters. The mistake is thinking the cure for fear is to look away. The cure for fear is to write it down, document it, and find one honest person who's willing to listen. Integrity isn't a feeling, it's a habit. It's the small, unglamorous decision to forward an email to your personal account on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody's watching. It's the willingness to spend your weekends photocopying documents at the kitchen table instead of watching the Colts game. It's choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. Again and again and again, until one day you look up and realize you've built something nobody can take away from you. The Brennan Vance family had credentials. I had habits. Habits beat credentials every time. The other thing I'd want my grandkids to understand is that wisdom isn't the same as intelligence. Saskia was intelligent, she was sharp, she was articulate, she could run a meeting better than I ever could. But she had no wisdom because wisdom is intelligence sharpened by experience and humbled by consequences. She'd never had to look a patient in the eye. She'd never had to tell a family their loved one died because of something that came out of a vial. People who've never paid a price for being wrong will always underestimate what being wrong costs. If you're sitting somewhere right now watching this and you're in a situation that feels like mine, here's what I'd tell you. You are not powerless. The system is bigger than any one bully who's trying to grind you down. There are laws written specifically to protect you. Lawyers who work on contingency. Regulators who became regulators because they wanted to do the right thing. You don't have to win the war alone. You just have to take the first honest step, then the next one, then the next one. The truth has gravity. Once it starts moving, the people who built their kingdom on lies can't stop it. They can only watch it come. That's what I learned. That's what I'm still learning. And every morning I'm grateful I didn't look away.